In the city of Bath, there was a language older than any spoken there, and it was the language of the door. A great crescent of houses stood along the hill in one long curve of golden stone, and every door in it was the same. The same fanlight arched above, the same brass polished to a hurtful shine, the same white steps scrubbed to the bone by a maid who had risen in the dark to scrub it. From the road below they stood alike as soldiers in a line, but the people behind them knew, as such people always know, that no two doors in Bath were ever equal, and that the whole worth of a life could be read in which of them opened to you and which did not. For a door in Bath was not a thing of wood and iron. It was a verdict. It opened, and you were someone. It stayed shut, and you were no one at all, and you might stand upon the scrubbed step until your feet went numb and learn from it the exact and final weight of the word no, which in that city was almost never spoken aloud, because it did not need to be. The door said it for them. A door could look down its cold fanlight at a caller upon the step and decide, in the time it took to draw one breath, whether the warmth that lived behind it was to be spent upon her or saved. And there was a young woman that winter who had come to know every door in Bath by heart because every one of them had closed. Her name was Linnet Calder, and 2 winters before she had been the daughter of a respected man. Now she was the daughter of Ambrose Calder, which was another thing entirely, and a thing that shut doors before she had finished saying it. She had come to the last house on the crescent as the light was going thin and amber. She stood on the step with her letter of character in her gloved hand, the glove worn pale at the fingertips, and she waited while the housekeeper read it a second time behind the half-open door. Linnet had taught herself to stand very still at such moments, and to keep her chin level, and to let no cold show in her face, because the cold was the one thing she would not give them. A woman who has lost the house she was born in, and the money, and the name, is left with very little to keep. She had found that the manner of her losing was the last of it, and she kept that with both hands. The housekeeper reached the foot of the letter where the name stood written plain. Linnet watched it happen, the small closing she had watched 100 times, over now, the way a face shuts as surely as any door. The warmth left it. The woman folded the letter along its creases and held it back out through the gap by one corner, as though it had been left out in the rain. "We have no place," she said. And then, because she was not an unkind woman, only a careful one, she added, "Lower, you will not find a place here, Miss Calder. Not under that name. There is talk enough in Bath to last the whole season. Try somewhere north, some town of smoke and iron where they have never heard of the hall that fell. Good evening to you." The door closed. It made almost no sound. The costly ones never did. And Linnet Calder stood alone on the white step in the last of the light, and understood, all at once and all the way through, the thing she had spent a fortnight refusing to understand. There was no door in all of Bath that would open to her. There was not going to be one. The hall that fell had been her father's greatest work, and his ruin in one stroke. Ambrose Calder had built for 30 years, without a single stone of his ever coming loose. A careful man who checked a load twice over and slept badly when a figure would not sit right in his book. When the gentlemen of Bath raised a subscription for a grand new assembly room on the rise above the river, a room to rival any in England, they came to Calder because a careful man was exactly what such a work wanted. He drew it. He costed it to the farthing. He watched it climb over 2 years, course by course, and was proud of it in the quiet way of a man who says little of what he feels. It came down in a single night in the autumn, before it had ever been opened, before a single soul had danced beneath its roof. It came down in a long roar that woke half the city from its beds, and in the gray morning there was a mountain of broken golden stone where the finest room in Bath had stood, and beneath it, one night watchman who lived, but would never again walk without a stick. They said the stone had been cheap stone dressed to look dear, the mortar thinned with sand, and the money gathered for a good work gone off into Ambrose Calder's own pocket, and there were papers to prove it. orders in his hand, figures in his book, his name at the foot of a bill for materials that had never been what the bill claimed. Linnet had sat in the courtroom through all of it. She had heard 3 men of business swear on oath that the writing was her father's, and heard her father answer, in a voice gone strange and old, that he had never once set his name to a lie, that some other hand had learned to make his letters, that the true accounts he had kept himself were not the ones the court was reading aloud. No one heeded him. A ruined man protesting his innocence is only a ruined man making a noise. He was found guilty of the fraud that had brought the hall down upon its watchman, spared the worst the law could do, and given the whole of the shame instead, and the shame did for him within the year. He died in a rented room in the spring, still saying it, still innocent, believed by no one living but his daughter. And she had learned in 2 hard years that a daughter's word weighs nothing against a court's paper. Someone had built that hall the fall and let her father carry the whole of it. Linnet knew it the way she knew her own name, and had no more proof than her father had, which was none that any court would hear. She had learned that to be right and to be believed are 2 separate countries, and that she was a citizen of neither. She had come to Bath because it was the last place she had any claim to try, and a little money left to try it with. The money was nearly gone now. She had sold her mother's garnet cross in the 2nd week to a man who had smiled while he named a price that was an insult, and she had swallowed the insult whole, because a person who is hungry cannot also afford to be proud. She had until the light failed to settle. The last thing there was left to settle, whether she had the courage still to go north, to begin again as nobody in some place that had never heard the name called her, or whether the courage was simply gone from her, now spent to the bottom, like everything else she had once had. It was in the square below the crescent, with the light very nearly gone, that the carriage found her. She heard it before she saw it, the heavy roll of good wheels over cold stone, and stepped back against the railings to let it pass, the way a person on foot learns to do without thinking. It did not pass. It slowed. It stopped level with her, a plain, dark carriage with no crest on the door, drawn by 2 good horses that steamed in the freezing air. A footman climbed down his livery, as dark and plain as the carriage itself, and asked with great civility, and not the smallest curiosity, whether he had the honor of addressing Miss Calder. She said that he had. She could not for her life think why a carriage should want her when not one door in Bath would. The footman held out a letter, a single folded sheet sealed with plain wax, her name on the front in a spare upright hand she had never before seen. She opened it there, in the cold, her fingers gone clumsy and slow, braced for she knew not what. Some forgotten debt of her father's come round at last, some fresh cruelty dressed up as an offer. It was 4 lines only. You are offered the place of companion and reader to my great-aunt, the Dowager Lady Sibylla, at Fastholme. The wages are £40 the year. The carriage that carries this will carry you also, if you choose to come. Choose freely. There was no name at the foot of it, only a single letter drawn larger than the rest, a plain upright A, set down the way a man sets his hand to a thing he fully means, and folded within the sheet, cold against her palm, there was a key. It was a plain iron key, old and heavy, worn, bright along one edge by long years of use, and then gone dull with disuse. A key made to fit some one particular door she did not know and could not guess. No word came with it, no line of the letter explained it. She stood in the last of the light holding a stranger's key in her bare cold hand, and felt the strangeness of it go through her, deeper than the cold had. "Whose carriage is this?" she asked the footman. "His Grace's, miss." "His Grace of where?" "Of Aldermere, miss." And Linnet Calder, who had believed there was nothing left in that city with the power to frighten her, felt her breath go thin and shallow, for she knew that name as well as everyone in the west of England knew it. The Duke of Aldermere was the very man they murmured of behind their hands in the same warm drawing rooms that had shut their doors upon her. He was the Duke who would never open his own. For as far back as anyone could rightly remember, no guest had crossed the threshold of Fastholme. The great house stood shut above its valley, with the half of its windows shuttered, its gates kept close, its rooms going gray under their Holland covers. One year after another, invitations came back unanswered. Callers were turned at the lodge before they had so much as seen the door. A duke was owed the whole of the world, and this one had refused to take delivery of it and shut his gate on the parcel. There were as many reasons given for it as there were mouths to give them. Some said a grief had done it, a death within those walls long years ago. Some said a madness kept quiet by his people. Some said he was only the proudest man in England, too proud to be looked upon, and these hated him the hardest, for there is nothing a world will forgive less readily than a man who plainly will not let it in. But on the one fact they were all agreed. The Duke of Aldermere let no living soul past his door. It was the surest thing in the county, surer than the tax and surer than the rain. Why, Linnet said aloud, to the footman, to the letter, to the cold key in her hand, why should he send for me? He does not know me. No one who knows my name sends me anything but the far side of a door. The footman had no answer to give her. He stood in the cold and waited. The horses stamped and steamed, and the last of the light slid off the golden stone above them and left it the color of ash. And Linnet Calder made the choice a person makes when the whole truth of the matter is that there is no choice left in it to make. She stepped up into the carriage of the man who let no one in. It was warm within, warmer than anywhere she had been in a fortnight, and a fur rug lay folded on the seat, as though set there for her and no one else. She drew it over her knees and hated, a little, how good it was. Then the door was closed upon her gently, and the carriage bore her out of the city that had refused her, into the falling dark, toward a shut house on a hill, with the key to a door she had never seen, held cold in her hand, and a reason for the whole of it she could not begin to guess. They came to Fastholme the next afternoon as the short day folded down toward dark, and Linnet saw at once it was, every inch, the house she had been warned of. It stood high and long above a narrow valley, a great gray house of older stone than Bath's, half its tall windows shuttered blind from within, so that it seemed to face the coming night with its eyes shut. No lamp showed along the front. The gates hung open only wide enough to pass a carriage, and closed again the moment the wheels were through, as though the house begrudged even that much of an opening. She had braced herself on the long, cold road for something grim, and here was grimness itself, a house that had turned its back on the living world and meant to keep it turned. She got down stiff and frightened in the courtyard, and thought she had come to the one place in England, colder than the step she had left. And then she saw the smoke. It rose from a single chimney at the far east end of the house, one thin thread of it going up gray into the still air, while every other chimney along that great cold roof stood dead. One room in all that shut house had a fire in it. And as Linnet stared, a door opened at the foot of that same east end, throwing a long warm bar of candlelight across the frozen cobbles, and a woman came hurrying out to meet her as though she were something looked for and long awaited. The woman was the housekeeper, a small round person with a kind, worried face, who gave her name as Mrs. Pethick, and took Linnet's worn valise from her frozen hands as gently as if it had been a thing of great worth. "Come you in out of the wicked cold," she said, and drew her indoors. Within, the house was as shut as its face had promised. Mrs. Pethick led her down a long corridor, where the furniture stood under Holland sheets in pale shrouded ranks. The air with the cold hush of rooms never entered, doors closed along both walls. But at the end of that dead passage, one door had warm light breathing beneath it, and to this the housekeeper brought her. "This is yours, miss," said Mrs. Pethick. "And here is the key of it, which you are to keep upon you. For the door locks, and the key is yours and no other soul's." Linnet took the plain iron key, and knew it at once for a twin of the one already cold in her pocket. Beyond the door was a small warm room with a fire burning steadily, a fire plainly lit and tended for hours, the bed aired, a jug of hot water breathing steam, everything within made ready as if for a guest they honored. Was I looked for so, exactly as this? Linnet asked, for the strangeness of it unsettled her more than any coldness could have. Something crossed the kind, worried face. "It is by His Grace's own order, miss," said Mrs. Pethick low. "He came down himself this morning to see the fire drew clean and the chimney did not smoke. He does not come to these rooms. In 12 years I have not known him give one living person the key of a door in this house. Why he has done it for you I could not say, for he tells no one why he does anything. But he has done it." She twitched the curtain straight and went to the door and turned there. "You are to lock it and be easy," she said. "There is no one at Fastholm will trouble you." She went out, and Linnet stood before the fire in the one-lit room of a shut house, holding 2 keys that were hers, and could not make sense of the warmth. In 2 years no one had readied a hearth for her before she begged for it. She had forgotten there were still places where such a thing was simply done, without a word, before ever it was asked. She met the great-aunt that evening, and the great-aunt, at least, made a kind of sense. The Dowager Lady Sibylla was a very small, very upright old woman of near 80, with a sharp-lined face and quick dark eyes, that took in the whole of Linnet at a glance and seemed to file it away for later. She talked. She talked from the instant Linnet entered the room, a dry running stream of it about the cold and the roads and the uselessness of the young and the price of candles, and it was some little while before Linnet understood that the talk was a mercy, that the old woman had marked her fright and was covering it, giving her time to sit by the fire and thaw and say nothing until she could bear to. "I will tell you my own part and no more," said Lady Sibylla at last, setting down her cup. "I am old and difficult, and I have worn out 3 companions in as many years, the last of whom left me weeping, which I am not proud of. My nephew grew tired of the finding of them. He proposed. That is the whole of my part in it. Why he chose you above another you must have from him, if ever you can get anything out of him at all, which I doubt, for I have been trying it these 30 years. She looked at Linnet a long moment. "I know your name, child." "I knew it before he sent." And she said nothing further upon that head, which was its own kind of answer, and turned the talk instead to the folly of Bath, which just now was falling over itself to praise the great Sir Rowland Vane for laying the first stone of the new assembly rooms, the very ones your poor father did not live to build. "The world," she said dryly, "reserves its loudest cheering for exactly the wrong man." Then she rang for more coals, and Linnet understood she had reached the edge of what the old woman would tell, and that the rest lay behind the one door in that house to which he had not been given a key. She saw him first in the gray of the following morning. She had slept badly in the strange bed, and had risen while the house was still dark and blue with the last of the night, and taken her 2 keys out into the dead passage to see, with a kind of held breath, what they opened. The first fitted her own door, as she had known it would. The second she tried in one door after another down that shrouded hall, and every one refused it, until near the end she came to a tall pair of doors, and the worn old iron turned sweet and easy in the lock, and she pushed them open upon a room that stopped the breath in her throat. It was a library, a long high room, with a gallery running round it, and more books than she had seen since her father's own small good shelves were carried out of their house and sold on the step to men he had never owed a farthing. A fire had been laid ready in the grate, though not yet lit, and she stood in the doorway of it and felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 2 whole years come quietly loose, and did not hear the man come in behind her, for he moved as silently as the house itself. She turned, and the Duke of Aldermere was standing in the far doorway watching her. He was tall and dark, his dark hair going early to gray at the temples, his still closed face giving away no more than the shut front of his own house did. But his eyes, when they rested on her, were not hard. They were a pale, clear gray, and held upon her with an attention so complete and so wordless that she felt it laid on her like a hand. She had braced herself through all the cold miles, for what a man might want of a woman he had taken in off a freezing street. Meeting those gray eyes across the long room, she understood, in a single beat of her heart, that she had braced against the wrong thing. There was something else in them, something she had no name for, something that looked, of all impossible things, like a debt long owed. "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied, and did not in the least know what else she was to do. He inclined his head. He did not come into the room, but stood upon its threshold, one hand on the doorframe, as though some invisible line lay across the sill that he would not, or could not, cross. For a long moment he only looked at her, and she had the strange sense of being read, the way she herself read a page, the whole of her taken in and set down somewhere, the mended gown, the 2 hard years in her face, the keys still in her hand. Then he said, in a low voice, roughened as if from long disuse, only 4 words, "The room is yours," and he turned and was gone, back into the dead dark of the shut house, without ever once having stepped over the sill. She stood holding that. "The room is yours, not welcome, not stay. Not I am glad you are come. Only the plain fact of the giving, set down and left, the way a man leaves a thing on a table who cannot bring himself to place it in your hand." She spent her first weeks at Fast Home, waiting for the price of it to be named. Everything the 2 hard years had taught her said nothing was given without one, and that the kindest seeming gifts were the ones whose reckoning came dearest at the last. So she watched for the catch buried under the warm room, and the lit fire, and the library thrown open to her, and the catch did not come. The Duke asked her for nothing, and no price was ever spoken, because there was. She began slowly and against every hard-won instinct to believe, no price, and that frightened her more than any price could have, for a price she understood and had learned to pay. This she had no way to read at all. She had imagined that a man who let no one past his door would do nothing behind it but brood over some old grief in the dark. She was wrong. The Duke worked quietly and without cease from a study whose door for once stood open, and the work that came out of that room went far beyond the running of his own great lands. Letters left Fast Home by the dozen, carried down to the valley by a single rider before the light, and money went out with them, and Linnet, who had the freedom of the house, began to catch, in glimpses, where the money went. She caught the first of it by chance in her 3rd week there. Lady Sibylla had sent her into the village on some errand of ribbons, and at the far end of the single street she came upon a knot of people, and a cart half loaded and an old man standing in the open door of a small stone cottage, his hat in his 2 hands, weeping without shame in the way of the very old. His name was Elias Rowe, and he had carried goods by cart along that valley for 50 years, until his eyes failed him, and his takings with them, and he had fallen behind on the rent of the cottage his wife had died in, and his children had been born in. The agent had come that week to turn him out. But the agent had come, so the neighbors were saying to one another in low, astonished voices, with a different paper in his hand. A paper that forgave the whole of the arrears, and set the rent of that cottage at 1 shilling the year for the rest of the old man's life, and never a word on it of who had ordered such a thing done. Linnet stood at the edge of the little crowd and heard old Elias tell it, over and over the way a man tells a thing he cannot yet believe. "Some fund," he kept saying, and shook his white head. "They tell me some charitable fund has done it." But his failing eyes went up the valley to where the gray house stood shuttered on its hill, and he lowered his voice as if he spoke of something holy. "There's no fund I ever heard of rode down my lane in the black dark of a morning, to look at my roof and see was it sound before the frost, and I felt him do it, miss. and Halton. I woke and heard a horse in my lane before light, and looked out, and there he sat, still as a stone in the saddle, looking at my roof tree, and gone again before I could get my boots to the door to bless him for it. He wiped his eyes on his sleeve, not caring who saw. There's a soul up on that hill does more good in the dark and unthanked than the whole of Bath does, by daylight with its name on a brass plate for it. I put him in my prayers by no name at all, for he has left me none to use. I reckon the Almighty knows the man I mean. Linnet walked back up the long hill to Fast Home with that insider, and it did not leave her for many days. She had come to Fast Home believing herself the one soul in the county who owed the Shut Duke a kindness she could not account for. She was nothing of the kind. She was one among a great many, a company of people each quietly saved by a hand. Not one of them had ever been let close enough to hold, and once she had learned how to look, the pattern was always the same. He did as good the way he lived behind a shut door, unseen, unthanked, never his name set to any of it, and always in the one particular shape, a roof kept a rent, forgiven. A wronged servant found a good place and a clean name before harm could reach her. Every time a door, the world was closing, and one man reaching quietly into the dark to hold it open, who would let no living creature reach and hold open his own. She asked Lady Sibylla of it once, of why it must all be done so hidden, and the old woman was quiet a long while over her needlework before she answered. "He does not care to be thanked," she said at last, "and do not mistake it for modesty. He has stopped believing that anything of his that is only offered, only spoken, only shown at a door is worth the having. A word can be a lie. A welcome can be a lie. He has known both to be. So he has given up on the things a man does at a threshold, and puts his whole faith in the things a man can do at a distance, in the dark, where nothing can be false. Money is not false. A roof over a family is not false. Himself, at his own door, face to face, he no longer trusts at all." She set a stitch, and did not look up. "He was not always so," she said, more quietly. "There was a time, and not so very long ago, when there was no welcome in the whole of the west of England warmer than the one you would have had at Fast Home. He believed then that if you only opened your door and your heart wide enough, the world would deal honestly with you in return. Something taught him otherwise, so hard and so cruelly, that he has kept every door in this house shut for 12 years since, and his own heart the most shut of all." She looked up then, her quick, dark eyes bright and hard. "I would give what little is left of my life to undo it, for the only person who could open those doors again is the man who shut them, and he will not." And Linnet, who had come to that house looking for the price of a kindness, began after that day to watch the Duke differently. Not for the price any longer, for the wound. The habit grew between them so slowly that Linnet could never afterward have named the day it started. She had taken to going down to the library in the cold blue hour before the house woke, for she slept ill still, and the great room of books was the one place at Fast Home where the band around her chest let go. She would light the fire herself and sit near it with a book. Then, one morning, the tall door swung without a sound and the Duke came in, and stopped when he saw her, and she rose in a fluster to give him back the room. He raised one hand, the smallest of motions, and she read it to mean she was to stay. He took up a book of his own, and the two of them sat on in the growing light, and did not speak. She had never, in her life, sat so easy in a silence. He came to speak to her more as the winter wore on, but sparingly, low and a little rough, the way a man speaks who has fallen out of the daily use of it. She found he could be drawn on a book if she said a wrong thing about it on purpose, for he seemed unable to let a wrong thing stand. She remarked one morning that the solemn old writer in her lap plainly thought a great deal of the poor, and had plainly never once shared a table with one. The Duke looked up. "He wrote his sermons on charity," he said, from a very warm study. There was something dry moving under the roughness, and Lynette laughed aloud before she could catch it the first time in that house, and watched the surprise of the sound cross his still face like a stone dropped into dark water. But the true talk between them was never the talk at all. It was the doors, for he began without ever once owning that he did it, to give her the house. It came a room at a time, always the same way. She would find of a morning a key set on the library table where her eye would catch it, a plain iron key with a folded scrap beneath it, naming the room it opened, and nothing else, no word, no signature, but the single upright letter she now knew for his. The first was the music room, shrouded and cold, a fine pianoforte gone dumb under its Holland sheet, which she uncovered and coaxed back into tune, and played again after 2 years of touching none but the iron sort. Next, a small parlor that caught the southern light, then the long gallery of pictures, then a walled garden through a door in the east wing, dead and frozen. Then, but hers to wake in the spring if she chose. She came to understand what she was being handed, and it moved her past anything spoken could have. A man who let no living soul past his outer door was opening his inner doors to her, one after another, in the only language he seemed to trust, the language of the deed done and not said. Where another man would have told her she was welcome, this one could not get the word out, and so gave her the keys, and the keys said it for him. She kept every one in a small box on her dressing table, a growing weight of cold iron, and could not at first have told anyone why, only that they were the truest speech she owned, and she would not give a word of it back. There came to Fastholme in the deep of the winter a Mrs. Cardew, who waited on Lady Sibylla twice a year out of an old duty, stayed too long, and knew the private business of every household for 30 miles. She looked Lynette over with a frank and hungry eye, made her small remarks, and worked her way across the tea toward the thing she had plainly come to sniff at. "Of course," she said comfortably, settling her cup, "one does hear his grace is not quite," and she tapped her own temple and smiled a small smile. "One cannot help but hear it. It is not a natural thing in a man, this shutting himself away. My own husband says a house that keeps its doors barred has a reason, and the reason is never a pretty one." Lynette set down her cup. She had not meant to speak. She heard herself begin. "Your husband is mistaken," she said, and her voice came out very level. "I have lived under this roof 3 months. In that time I have seen a blind old carter kept in the cottage. His wife died in for 1 shilling a year. A wronged girl found a good place before harm could reach her. Roofs mended in the dark, and children kept off the parish, every stroke of it done by a hand that took the most particular care never to be seen nor thanked. That is not the work of a man with a shameful reason to bar his doors, Mrs. Cardew, and it is the work of a man who has decided a welcome given at a door can be a lie, and a roof given in the dark cannot, and deals only in the things that cannot lie. I could wish there were more men so afflicted, and fewer who tap their brows over the tea and name it conversation." There was a silence. Mrs. Cardew's smile set hard on her face. Across the room, Lady Sibylla made a small sound into her needlework that was not quite a cough, and Lynette, her heart going hard, understood 2 things at once: that she had just been unforgivably rude to a guest, and that she had meant every word and would say it all again. She did not know then that he came to hear of it. He came to hear of everything that passed at Fastholme. That evening there was a key on the library table, as there had been others, but folded beneath it this time was more than the name of a room. There were 3 words in the lean upright hand, and beneath them the letter. It said, "I heard. Thank you." She stood holding it a long while, for it was the first time he had set that word down for her, and she could not lay it back on the table and put it into the box with the keys instead. He watched her a great deal more that winter than she knew, and thought a great deal more than he ever set down. He had planned the whole of it, in the cold, careful way. He now planned everything: find the daughter, take her in before the winter finished her, do for her in deeds what he had failed to do in words for another, long ago, see her safe, and when at last the proof was whole, hand her back her father's stolen name, a debt with a shape to it, a thing a man could pay to the last farthing and then be quit of and shut his door again in peace. He had not planned for the mornings in the library. He had not planned for a woman who told him he was wrong about a book and had the right of it and did not soften it for his being a duke. He had not planned for the way he found himself coming down in the blue hour, not for the books at all, but for the plain fact that she would be there. There were mornings now when the words rose in him whole and wanting out, and he had to give her a key instead, because he no longer trusted his own welcome. He had welcomed once with his whole open heart and armed a murderer with the welcoming. So he gave her keys and kept the last of his doors shut and told himself it would do. And he knew, in the part of a man that will not lie to him in the blue hour before the light, that it had not done for some time, and that the wall he had held for 12 years was coming down whether he willed it or not. It was Lady Sibylla who told her in the end, or told her the start of it, the thread that ran into all the rest. It was a hard, bright morning near the middle of February, and the old woman was in one of her fierce moods. She looked up from her needlework and said, with no lead-in at all, "You still do not know why he sent for you. It is wearing you to the bone. I mean to break my word to my nephew and tell you a part of what I know, for I am near 80, and have earned the right to break a word or two before I go, and because I think you will do some foolish thing out of not knowing, and I had rather you did it out of knowing, which has at least a chance of being the right foolishness." She set the needlework in her lap. "Tell me, child, do you know the name of the man they are cheering just now in Bath?" "Sir Rowland Vane," said Linnet. "They mean to honor him. He lays the first stone of the new rooms this month, on the very ground where my father's hall came down." She heard her own voice go bitter and did not trouble to hide it. "The whole city loves him. He gives to every good cause. He is the great man of the West now." "He is," said Lady Sibylla, and her old face was grim as winter. "A great man, a giver to good causes, and the most complete and dangerous villain I have known in a long life full of them. Sit still and hear me, for I shall say at once. There was a young man 12 years ago," she said, "that my nephew loved better than a brother. Edmund Thorne, an honest lawyer and a poor one, honesty being an expensive thing to keep at the law. My nephew was then all the things you have been told he is not. Open and warm and glad. And he kept the doors of this house wide to the whole county. Into that welcome, one season came a charming and rising man of business, clever and much admired, and my nephew, young and trusting where he liked, took to him and opened every door of this house to him, and set his own good name behind the man wherever he went. That was Rowland Vane, before his knighthood, before his fortune, and my nephew's open door was the finest rung he ever set his foot on. Linnet had gone very still. Vane was even then quietly ruining Edmund Thorne," said the old woman, robbing a trust that Edmund's name stood surety for, and forging Edmund's honest hand to carry the theft, so that when the loss came to light, it should seem the honest man had done it. And when it was found, and Edmund accused, my nephew did the thing his whole open heart told him to do. He stood up, willed him, in a full room, before everyone who mattered. He named Rowland Vane for the thief he was, swore Edmund Thorne innocent, and staked all he had on the saying. She paused, and they laughed at him. "Child, that is the thing you must hold to if you are ever to understand the man whose keys are in your box upstairs." For everyone knew how my nephew had loved Vane, had championed him, had opened this very house to him not a 12-month before, and so they said the young duke had merely quarreled with a favorite and turned on him from spite. And worse, they took his own warm patronage of Vane and held it up as the proof of Vane's good character. Would the Duke of Aldermere have kept open house for a thief? My nephew's welcome was made the shield that guarded the guilty man, and his open door armed the hand that struck his friend. Edmund Thorne was ruined and broke and dead of it inside the year, still innocent, believed by no one that counted but the friend whose championing had only sunk him deeper. "That is what Aldermere has carried 12 years, said Lady Sibylla. "Not only that he failed, that he made it worse, that he opened his heart and his house with his whole trusting soul, and the opening was the weapon. A thing like that will cure a man of doors. It cured him. From that day, he has not believed that a welcome of his, a word of his, anything offered at a threshold, is worth the risk of it, for his offering once cost a good man his life. So he shut every door in this house and took to doing his good, the only way he could still trust in the dark, where his open heart could harm no one ever again. And he waited. For what? Said Linnet, though she thought now that she knew. For the proof he had lacked at the first, said the old woman. 12 years gathering in the dark what he could not gather in the daylight, then the banker's true record. The forger Vane paid, and the forger's word, and the honest books of every trust Vane has robbed since, kept always in the hand of some careful honest man Vane meant to blame. She looked at Linnet steadily, and the old eyes gentled. 2 winters ago, child, that same Roland Vane wanted a fortune to build his standing higher, and there was money gathered in Bath for a grand assembly room, and a careful honest builder set to raise it. You know the rest better than I. The hall was built to fall, the money went into Vane, and your father's honest hand was forged to carry the theft, exactly as Edmund Thorne's had been forged 12 years before. My nephew knew that hand the moment he heard of it. He could not save your father, who was tried and broken and dead before the proof was whole. But your father had a daughter, living somewhere, paying for a crime that was not even her own. And my nephew swore that this once, the thing he had failed to save would not be lost entire. When he heard the Calder girl was in Bath, turned from every door, he did the first thing a shut man can do. He opened his own. She took up her needlework again, and her old hands were not quite steady. "There," she said. "Now you know why the fire was lit before you asked it. It was not lit for a companion, child. It was lit for a debt. I have broken my word to tell you so, and I do not repent it. You will not tell him I told you. And you will do now whatever the knowing tells you that you must." And Linnet sat very still in the cold, bright room, and understood at last the debt she had seen in the gray eyes that first morning in the library, and the keys, and the shut doors, and the whole grim shape of the man, and she understood, with a pang that took the breath clean out of her, that every kindness of that strange winter, the fire, and the keys, and the opened rooms, and the thank you folded under the iron, had none of it been done for her at all. It had been done for a dead man. She could no longer even grieve aloud, out of a guilt 12 years old that had nothing to do with her. And she understood sitting there, that she had come, somewhere in that winter of lit fires and open doors, to want with her whole heart that she might. This was the folly the old woman had watched gathering. Somewhere among the keys and the quiet mornings, Linnet had come to love the man who let no one in, and he had no notion of it and never would, for he took himself to be settling an old account and nothing more. It sat ill with her. Pride was nearly all she had carried out of the wreck of her old life, and there is little so galling to a proud woman as to love a man whose gentleness toward her is only an apology, laid at her dead father's feet. For a day, she told herself the clean thing was to take what the old woman had given her, and be gone before the wanting grew teeth. She stayed, and why she stayed was the hinge the whole of it turned upon. It was not that her courage had failed again, and it was not only love, though love was folded into it somewhere. It was that the cold mornings in the library had shown her the man beneath the wound, and that man was worth more than any debt, and a good deal more than her pride. Here was someone walled alive for 12 years around a hurt no living hand had ever reached, and she was perhaps the single person breathing with a hope of reaching it. She had come to that shut house to be rescued. She began to see the rescuing might run the other way, and that to have a thing to give which no one else alive could give was worth more to a woman stripped of everything than any wage or any warm room. So she did not go. There was a night that turned the weather between them, though as ever not a word marked it. She had gathered without asking which night it was. The haul had come down on this night 2 years gone, and by some malice of the almanac, it fell within a day of the older grief, the one 12 years buried. She woke to a house under siege by wind-rain thrown in fistfuls at the shutters, and rose without knowing her reason and carried a candle along the dead passage. The library door stood open. Inside there was no light, but the sullen last of a fire burnt to nothing, and the Duke sat before it with his face in his hands, every guard off him, unmade in a way no one was ever meant to witness. She might have crept away. She went in. She set down her candle, took the chair across the cold hearth from him, and offered nothing, because nothing words could say would mend it, and he himself had taught her that year how much a person says by staying and holding their tongue. She sat the black hour out with him. 2 people awake in a barred house on the one night of the year the shut man could not weather alone, and when the wind dropped and a thin gray crept along the shutters, he lifted his head and found her there. Not the fire. The hole heard open in the gray eyes, and for once no shut door and no cold key between them, only the bare fact of the pair of them, undefended in the coming light. How long it held she could never afterwards say. Then a coal broke and slid in the grate, the plain morning walked back into the room, and the thing folded itself quietly away. Yet it had been. They had both been present when it was, and what has once stood between 2 people will not be talked back out of standing, however long the 2 of them keep their proud silence over its name. The trouble came, as that kind of trouble always does, from the one with the most to lose by the truth, who saw the danger long before either soul at Fastholme saw it. Sir Roland Vane was at the very summit of his winter. The city was to fed him. His name was to go on the first stone of the great new rooms. He had built his whole life since the far-off season of Edmund Thorne on the same 3 pillars, a spotless name, a fortune whose beginnings no one now examined, and the warm regard of a county that had quite forgotten he had ever been anything but great. He guarded all 3 the way a man guards the only things he has, with the sharp animal instinct of such a man for the one scent on the wind that could bring the whole of it down. He knew the Calder girl was at Fastholme, and whose daughter she was, and he knew, better than anyone living, that there was in all of England exactly one man who had ever stood in a full room and named him for what he was, and that this same man had now taken the daughter of Vane's latest ruin into his shut-house. Vane did not know how much Aldermere held, or whether he held anything past an old grudge, but he was not a man who waited to learn. He moved to end the danger before it could grow teeth in the way that had never once failed him, pleasantly, at a distance, leaving no mark that could be traced to his gloved hand. He began with the oldest weapon. There is a young woman's good name. It was so very easy, and that was the cruelty in it. A girl already disgraced in her father, unmarried, living now in the shut-house of a man the whole county called mad, a man who let no one in and had let this one girl in. The thing had only to be said aloud in the right voice, with the right small sigh of regret, for the saying to do the rest by itself. Vane said it. He said it graciously, with a great show of reluctance, in a dozen drawing rooms at once. Such a pity, he would murmur, that the Calder girl, whatever one thought of the poor father, and here the smallest pause, should have thrown away the last shred of her name by going to live so very irregularly, so very alone in that closed house with a man of whom one heard such strange things. and he let the little sigh finish the sentence he was too careful ever to finish himself. Within a month it was everywhere. No longer a shut duke's charity to a ruined man's daughter, but a scandal, open and spreading, fastening on Lynette exactly as the first disgrace had fastened, doing precisely the work it was built to do. It made her presence at Fast Home a thing that would ruin, in the end, not only herself, but the fierce old woman who had been kind to her, and the shut man who had taken her in. She learned of it, the slow way one learned such things. A letter unanswered, a face turned aside in the village, a coldness where a month before there had been a civil word. And then, all at once, on a single gray afternoon, she learned the whole of it. She had driven out with Lady Sibylla to a house in the county where the old woman had been received and deferred to for 50 years. The carriage was left standing at the door an unconscionable time. Then the daughter of the house came out to them herself, pink and wretched, and said, not meeting their eyes, that her mother was very sorry, but was not at home. Lady Sibylla, near 80 years old, who had not been refused at a door in the whole of her long life, sat very straight and very still in the carriage, and said not one word until they were away down the lane and out of sight of the house. Then she said in a voice shaking with a rage Lynette had never once heard from her, "So, it has come to this. They will shut their doors on me, at my age, after 50 years, sooner than shut them on Roland Vane." And beneath the rage, plain and terrible, Lynette heard the hurt of it, and knew, with a sick certainty settling into her like cold water, that she herself was the cause, that her presence was ruining the one person who had shown her an unguarded kindness. The only decent thing left to her was the very thing she had refused a month before, to go and take the poison of it with her, and leave these two their doors and their peace. So she made up her mind that she would do it. And that evening, for the first time in the whole of that long, strange winter, she went of her own will to find the Duke of Aldermere, to tell him she was leaving, and to give him back, one by one, every key he had ever laid upon the table for her. He was at his desk with the door standing open, the candles burning, his lean, upright script running on across a sheet. He glanced up as she filled the doorway, and something surfaced in the still gray face and was pressed down before it could be read. She kept to the threshold as she always had, and made herself lay it out whole and plain, because he was a man who had schooled her in the worth of the plain thing. Said plainly, and an honest word honestly given was the last coin she had to offer him. "Let me go," she said. "You know the thing being whispered. You know the mouth it comes from. Today your aunt was kept standing at a door that has opened to her for 50 years, and it was kept shut because of me, because I am under this roof. That man means the ruin of all three of us, and he will have it. For a lie in a clever mouth is a thing no answer reaches. I will not be the knife he does it with." Her voice snagged, and she pulled it level. "And I know the rest of it now. Your aunt told me. I know about Edmund Thorne, and what was done to my father, and what you did 12 years ago, and what it took out of you. I know this was never a post for a companion. It was a debt, and you have overpaid it many times over. You owe my father nothing more, and you never owed me anything at all. Let me go, and the talk will follow me out of the valley, and your aunt keeps her doors and you keep your quiet. It is the one good thing left in me to do for any of you, and I am asking you to let me do it." The silence that came then was not one of the winter's easy ones. She saw his hand go to the pen, 12 years of habit, reaching to set his answer down at arm's length on paper, where it could be weighed and made safe. She saw the hand stop and lay the pen back untouched. Some hard labor was going on behind the gray eyes, the labor of a man who had met the whole world in ink and from a distance for 12 years and had come up at last against a thing ink would not meet. He stood. He came round the desk. And then he did what she had not once seen him do in the whole of that winter. He came to the doorway she stood in and stepped through it. He crossed the same sill he had refused that first gray morning, when he gave her the room but kept the threshold for himself and stood close in front of her in the passage on her side of the door, the man who admitted no one standing of his own will outside his own defenses. She had to tip her face up to meet his. No. The one word came low and cracked from long disuse, and the saying of it plainly wrung him. It was, she thought, the strangest sound she had ever heard, that bare spoken no, laid down to keep her by a man who had made a locked door his whole shield against the living world. No, he said again, and the word came steadier the second time, still rough, but sure, the way a hand steadies on a thing it has not held in years. You do not go. He drew a breath, and the price of it crossed his face. I let the debt stand between us, he said, because a debt was a shape I could hold. Everything I have paid from behind a shut door, and a debt has an edge and a bottom to it. I could clear it and lock the door and be safe, but it has not been a debt for a long time. It stopped the morning you told me I had a book wrong, and had the right of it, and did not trim the saying, because I was a duke. I did not tell you so. I had taught myself that nothing I offered aloud, no welcome of mine, was worth the danger of it. Since the last time I opened my whole heart, a good man was buried by it. So I let the debt do my lying for me and gave you iron keys in the place of the truth. And that was the act of a coward. I am finished with it. He drew straighter, and the gray eyes cleared and hardened. Vain does not ruin you. I will stop him, by the one road I have refused to set foot on for 12 years. You have taught me this winter, and never meant to, that there is a thing worse than opening your door and watching the opening do harm. It is to keep the door barred, and watch the harm come through it anyway, and call the barring sense. I called it sense for 12 years. It was fear, and you have unmade the fear in me. The hard corner of his mouth shifted, the barest beginning of a thing she had never seen on him. Go up now, Linnet, he said. Trust me, and say no more to me of leaving. She had no word to give him. She who had carried all the talk of that winter stood, struck dumb in his doorway. It is a good deal harder, he said, quieter, with something like ruefulness in it, when the turn to speak is your own. Go up. There are letters I mean to write tonight, and for the first winter in 12, I know to the last word what belongs in them. The great civic assembly was held that year, as every year in the long bright rooms of the city, and this year it was held to honor Sir Rowland Vane, who was within the week to lay the first stone of the grand new rooms on the ground where the fallen hall had stood. Everyone came who was, anyone for 30 miles, burning with the story of the shot duke and the disgraced Calder girl, come to see Rowland Vane, crowned the first man of the West. And Rowland Vane came to it certain, at the very height of his long climb, that he had already won. He had good reason. The daughter was disgraced now twice over, and the fierce old aunt was shut out of doors across the county. And the mad-shut Duke of Aldermere could no more come out to defend them than the dead could come out of the ground. Vane had built his whole plan on that shut door, and there was no surer thing in England than that shut door. He swept into the bright rooms in his finest, was received as a king, and permitted himself, greeting this person and that, the smallest and most regretful mention of poor deluded Lady Sibylla, and of the Calder girl of whom he sighed, the less said now the kinder. And he watched the mentions do their quiet work, and was content. Linnet had not wished to come. The Duke had asked her to. He had not left a key and a folded line on a table for her to find. He had asked her aloud in his rough, relearned voice, looking at her as he said it. She had found she could refuse him nothing when he spent his hard-won words on the asking. So she came in on Lady Sibylla's thin arm, into the long, bright rooms full of the very people who had shut every door in the city against her. She held her back straight, fixed her eyes on the far end of the room, and waited to be cut, and was cut, thoroughly and at once, by 100 people in the one moment, the cold shoulders turning, the little pool of empty floor opening around her, and the old woman, as around a thing diseased. She bore it, She had borne worse. Beside her, Lady Sibylla bore it too, fierce and upright, and near 80, and the two of them stood in their small ring of cold, empty air, while the bright assembly glittered and murmured all around them. And across the room, at the warm heart of it, Sir Rowland Vane caught Linnet's eye over the heads of the crowd and smiled at her, pleasantly, the smile of a man watching a thing end exactly as he had arranged. And then a strange stillness began at the far doors, spread inward, turned every head with it, and the music faltered and died. The Duke of Aldermere had come in. People did not at first grasp what they were seeing, for the thing lay so far outside the order of the known world that the eye refused it. None had seen him in a public room in 12 years. He came in through the doors. No one had thought he would ever darken, the man who let no one into his house walking, of his own will, into the most crowded room in the west of England. He was in plain dark clothes among all that glitter, and bareheaded, and he stood a moment just within the threshold, and the room fell back from him in a widening ring of quiet. They made way. They supposed, those who could think at all, that he must be leaving already, or come on some errand to his aunt. He did not go to his aunt. He walked the whole long length of that bright room, slowly, through the parting crowd, to the little island of cold, empty floor where Linnet stood with her back straight and her chin level, and took his place beside her, inside the ring of shunning, so that the empty space made to mark her out now held a duke, and the making of it all at once cost the makers something. Then he turned and faced the room, and did the thing not one soul in that county had seen him do in 12 years. He spoke to them, aloud. "You will forgive me," said the Duke of Aldermere, and his voice came rough at the first, then steadied, and carried down the whole long room into a stillness you could have cupped in your hands. "You will forgive me if I am clumsy at this. I am long out of the practice of speaking, as you have all been so good as to remark these 12 years. You have made a great deal, in that time, of my shut doors. You have called them pride and madness, and some of you worse. I will tell you tonight what they were. 12 years ago, he said, in a room a good deal like this one, a man I loved better than my own life was destroyed for a crime another man had done, Edmund Thorne, the most honest man I have known. A trust he stood surety for was robbed, his honest hand forged to carry the theft, and he was ruined and broke and dead of it, inside the year, innocent, and believed by almost no one. I knew him innocent, and knew to a certainty the name of the man who had robbed the trust and forged the hand, and let my friend carry it into his grave. And so, being young, and trusting to the plain force of the truth, I stood up in a full room, a room exactly such as this, and said that name aloud. A stir went through the assembly. "And you laughed," he said. "Some of you here tonight laughed at me that night. You called me a green boy and a fool and a spiteful child, crying wolf on his own former favorite. For I had befriended the guilty man, opened my house to him, set my name behind his, in my folly, and so when at last I turned and named him, you took my own past welcome of him and held it up as the proof of his innocence and of my madness. My open door was made the shield that guarded him. My speaking did not save Edmund Thorne. It helped bury him deeper, and it taught me a lesson you were all most diligent in the teaching of, that the truth, spoken in a room like this one, with no weight behind it, is worth nothing, and may be turned into a weapon against the very man it was spoken to, save his voice filled the room now, steady and cold. So I said no more. For 12 years I said no more and shut my doors and did what good I could in the only way that could no longer be twisted, in the dark, without my name, and I waited. I have spent 12 years gathering, in silence, the one thing I lacked in this room 12 years ago. The weight, the proof. He drew from within his dark coat a packet of papers and held it up, and the whole bright room was utterly, breathlessly still. "The man who robbed the Thorne Trust 12 years ago," said the Duke, "and forged Edmund Thorne's hand to carry it, and let an innocent man die of it, is in this room tonight. He is the man you have gathered to honor, and because it served him so well the once, he did the same again. 2 winters past, you raised a subscription to build a grand assembly room and set an honest builder to raise it. His name was Ambrose Calder. His hall was built cheap and made to full. The money that should have raised it true went into one man's fortune, and Calder's honest hand was forged to carry the theft, precisely as Edmund Thorne's had been forged 12 years before, by the very same hand, to the very same end. Ambrose Calder was innocent. He died of the shame of a crime he never did, and his daughter has been made to pay for it since at every door in this city, including, I do not doubt, most of the doors in this room. He turned his head and looked once, only once, at Sir Rowland Vane, who stood alone now in a space of floor that had begun, very quietly, to open around him. "The man who did both these things," said the Duke of Aldermere, "is Sir Rowland Vane. I hold the proof of it here. The true accounts kept in Ambrose Calder's own honest hand that the court never saw. The banker's record Vane believed burned, and the sworn confession, and the living body of the man he paid to forge an honest hand twice 12 years apart. The last of it came to me only this winter. Until then, I had the certainty and not the weight, and I learned in this very room 12 years ago what certainty without weight is worth. I have the weight now. Rowland Vane ruined 2 innocent men and meant to die honored for it. I will not let that stand 1 hour longer, whatever the cost, to his name or to mine. Ambrose Calder was innocent. Edmund Thorne was innocent. This woman beside me is innocent of everything but the misfortune of her father, and the next person in this room who offers her the smallest unkindness will answer to me for it directly." There is a stillness that presses harder than any uproar, and it fell now on the long, bright rooms. In the middle of it stood Sir Rowland Vane, alone, the pleasant smile gone at last and wholly from his face, and one by one, and then all together, the whole assembly turned slowly to look at him. He had built his entire life on a dead man's silence, a buried thing, and a shut ducal door. The door had opened and walked the length of the room, and the buried thing lay unearthed in a duke's raised hand before every soul that mattered in the county. There was no gracious sigh that could cover it now. He looked, in that moment, not like the great man of the West, but like exactly what he was, a thief of long standing who had just heard the ground open beneath 30 years of climbing. He did not speak. He gathered the poor remnant of his dignity and went out through the parting, staring crowd alone, into the cold he had made ready for someone else. And the doors of that county began to close behind him, one after another, in the weeks that followed, exactly as they had once closed on Lynette Calder. There was one more thing she learned, later in the quiet after, and it undid her past all the rest together. Her father's name was mended that spring, soberly in a small office, and not a grand hall, the loud work being already done. It took lawyers and months, and a duke's weight leaned on the scale, and at the last there was a document that stated, in the flat words such papers use, that Ambrose Calder of Bath had been wrongly charged, stood clear of any fault, and had his good name given back to him and to those who came after him. Lynette read it in the library at Fastholm in the grey of an early morning, the Duke beside her, and the tears she had drilled out of herself across 2 hard years came at last. He kept no silence this time, and reached for no pen. He drew her against him and let her cry, and had nothing to say. For nothing wanted saying, and it was the fullest of all that winter's fullnesses. He never had it, she said, when the words would come. That is the stone I cannot lift. His name is his again, and he is in the ground. He went out of the world. Sure he had failed at it. Sure his whole plain honest life had come to nothing, and left his girl a byword, with not a friend to swear for her. He had one, said the Duke. She looked up and had not known it. I went to him, he said low. At the end, I had no proof to give him yet, only my certainty. But I stood in that hired room, a man he had never met, and told him I knew the truth of it, that I had watched the same wrong worked on a man I loved before him, and that I would not lie down until it was set right, however many years it asked. All I could put in his hand was my word, and I knew by then how little my word would buy. I gave it to him, even so. He knew. Linnet. Before the end, he knew that one man in the world stood with him. It was not his name, and it was not his life, and it was not enough. But he did not die believing himself alone in it. That much I could see, too. He was still a while, and then said the thing she kept the rest of her life. That was the last door I went through unasked, he said, in 12 years. I told a dying honest man I believed him, and then I rode home and shut my own, and I did not open it to a soul, nor go through any threshold I was not dragged through. From that night until this winter, when I sent a carriage into a cold city after his daughter. And she saw the whole of it then, 12 barred years, pinned at their two far ends by the only two doorways he had allowed himself, her dying father's and her own, broken at the last by a girl who had come to his gate owning nothing and handed him back, without ever meaning to, the use of his own doors. One door in the house he had never given her. She had marked it that first gray morning, the door at the heart of the east wing that neither key would take, and left it be all winter, as one leaves the single thing plainly not on offer. She believed she knew by now what it kept. It was Edmund Thorne's room, kept as it had stood 12 years before, a room the master went into alone and let no other eye see, the shut and shrouded middle of the whole shut house. He took her there himself at the tail of that spring. He did not leave the key on a table for her to find, the way of all the others. He set it in her palm and closed her fingers over it. The first time in their whole acquaintance his hand had shut on hers, and walked her down the passage and stood by while she turned it in the lock herself. And the room past the door was no tomb after all. It was the best in the house, tall and full of light, with a wide south window that held the whole afternoon. 12 years it had been shut and sheeted for grief. But the sheets were gone now, the window unshuttered to the day, a fire set going in the long-dead grate, and it stood warm and ready, and plainly made ready for her. "I have kept this room shut 12 years, he said. "I could not open it, and I could not part with it, and I could not go into it, and I could not let it go. I never understood the keeping, only that I could do no other. The gray eyes were not shut now, nor hard, nor on their guard. "I understand it at last," he said. "I was holding it. Not for the dead man, whatever I told myself. Some part of me, wiser than the rest, was keeping the finest room in this house shut and waiting all those years against the one person who could make it a room for the living again in the place of a grave. I did not know it would be you. I did not know it would be anyone. But it was always going to have to be someone. And it is you." He said his name to her then, the name no mouth in that house had ever given her, for the servants had only ever his grace, and which she will lend you now so that you have it as she had it, Alaric. And there in the light of the opened room, in his rough new voice, he asked her, having first through his lawyers and his letters made her wholly free, her father cleared, her own name restored, and left her beholden to no living creature, so that whatever she chose she would choose out of no need, and no gratitude, and no lack of another place to stand. He asked her to stay. Not to keep his aunt company, not to close a debt, not because she had nowhere else, but only if she wished to. He asked her to marry him, and to hold his doors open the rest of his days, for he had learned that he could bear the opening of them for her, and could not think how to want it for anyone else, and that he had 12 years of shut rooms in him he would dearly like if she were willing to unlock one at a time. And Linnet Calder, who had come to that house in the dead of winter with everything she owned in one worn bag and no road in front of her, stood in the last and best room of it and made the choice that was hers alone at last, freely, with nothing driving it and nothing to fear. She put her palm to his hard cheek the first time she had ever touched him so, and told him yes. She gave him back his own name, Alaric, that he might hear it said in kindness, and told him she would keep his door standing open as long as the two of them lived, though he was to know she had grown fond of one or two of the silences, and meant to keep those. They married at Fastholm in the early summer, with no crowd, for grandeur suited neither of them. The old woman took her place at the front and wore the look of a general reviewing a campaign she had won, and held to it past her 90th year, that in the main she had. The county doors that had shut on the bride stood open by then, quick with welcome and with shame, and she found she had small use for them, knowing now to the last penny what such doors were worth. But the doors of Fastholm she flung wide, that summer and every summer after, and the barred house that had let no one over its sill for 12 years became the openest and kindest in the whole of the West, its shutters down, its fires up, its master on his own step to meet whoever came up the hill. A talking man he never grew, and never would, but he grew into a man who could say the one thing that counted, aloud to the one it counted for, in the hour it counted, and lift his own latch of a morning with his own hand, and that was the sum of all she had ever asked of him, and far past what the world had thought was in him. She kept the keys to the end of her days, the whole winter's hoard of them, that small cold weight in the box on her table, the unspoken half of the courtship of a man who could not, that first hard season, say the thing, and so had set it indoors. And on the wall of the room he had saved for her, she hung the first gift he ever gave her, the 4 lines of a letter, and beneath them one plain iron key, the key that had come folded into a stranger's charity to a frozen hand on the worst night she had lived, and had opened in the end every door worth opening. No stranger to the story could ever have guessed why a duchess should frame in honor so bare a scrap of iron. Linnet needed no guessing. Every noble house in the city had turned her from its step, one after another in the hardest winter of her life, and had been right to by the only reckoning such houses keep. And one man who opened his door to nobody, who had barred every door he owned against a world that had schooled him to it, spoke her not one word of welcome, and only kept back the last and best of his rooms, and put the key of it in her hand. That was the whole of her happiness when all was counted. And it had begun with a shut door, and a key, and never a welcome spoken.